Understanding Mercury in the sixth house begins by understanding the sixth house and Mercury. So let's begin by reviewing what these two symbolize. The sixth house is the area of the sky that's directly below the western horizon. So it symbolizes things that support or uphold the sunset. Sunset has two connotations: disappearance and other people. So for example, the sixth is the house of illness, because disease leads to death and death is disappearance. The sixth is the house of dreads, things that you do not want to see, things that you're worried about, things that you're fearful of. The sixth is the house of minorities, the people who are overlooked, the subordinates. And the sixth is the house of enemies, so it's about people who take from you. So enemies, thieves, rivals, competitors. The sixth is the house of conflict, how we get into conflict with the people that are trying to take from us. So it's all about struggles, weapons, efforts to defend. And finally, the sixth is the house of debts, and having our resources benefit other people instead of us. So that's what the sixth house basically represents. Now we just need to do a quick review of what Mercury represents. Mercury is the planet of intellect. And intellect has to do with putting things into codes and patterns. So it's a planet that symbolizes communication, because communication is what happens when you encode something in a format like a number, a word, a language, and then you can transmit it to somebody else. So Mercury has to do with communication. Mercury has to do with interaction, because that's what communication is. So it has to do with exchanging things, exchanging information, exchanging goods, trade. Mercury has to do with relationship, because that's what happens when you interact and exchange with people, you develop relationship. So Mercury is friendly, likes to form relationships. And finally, Mercury has to do with recreation or relaxation, because that's what happens when you have friendly relationships. Now, about patterns, Mercury is all about learning. Learning is the ability to recognize patterns and make sense of them. Mercury is the planet of organization, because organization means knowing your patterns and keeping things in the right patterns. Mercury is the planet of symmetry, because symmetry means having balanced patterns. Mercury is the planet of dexterity, because if you're balanced, then you have a lot of dexterity. So now that we're refreshed about what Mercury symbolizes and what the sixth house symbolizes, all that we really need to do is put them side by side and see where they connect. For example, Mercury represents friendship, but the sixth house is about enemies. So they're connecting here in a conflicting way. And so this is something very important about Mercury in the sixth house, which we have to devote some attention to try to unpack into an interpretation that we could put into words. Another thing is that Mercury represents exchange, but the sixth house represents conflict. And that's again a connection between Mercury and the sixth house, which is not really affable. Mercury wants to exchange and cooperate with others, but the sixth house wants to exchange with conflict. So that's another thing about Mercury in the sixth house that we can call a seed. You start to get a clear intuition already about what's going on with this planet in this house. A third and final thing that's important with Mercury in the sixth house is that Mercury has to do with relaxation, but the sixth house has to do with anxiety. So Mercury is not really connecting with the sixth house in very favorable or easy ways. So a lot of people who are watching this video who want to just hear a good thing will suddenly get upset with me for only presenting negative things about Mercury in the sixth house. But hold on to your hats, because this is way too early in the astrological game to determine whether something comes out positively or negatively for you, as I'll show in a bit. So put aside your distaste for hearing negative things and just hear about Mercury in the sixth house, and then think about how that would actually work in some conditions. It could produce really bad interpretations, yes, and it also could produce really good interpretations. So let's take a look at these three seeds and see how they might grow into more verbalizable interpretations. For example, Mercury represents friendship and the sixth house represents enemies. So people with the Mercury in the sixth house, they could be described by the word separative, in the sense that they're not really eager to accept new friends, and they tend to assume enmity or dangerousness in others. So one saying for them is, you are my enemy until proven my friend. If you prove yourself my friend, then you're my friend. But otherwise, I have to assume that you're my enemy. Now, you might not like the way that sounds. That might sound like a negative thing. And it can be a very negative thing, but it can also be a very positive trait. Because, folks, that is the world. It can be a very healthy thing to have this attitude. It can be very helpful when dealing with the actual world, which is full of enemies. Let's look at the second seed now of Mercury in the sixth house, which was that Mercury has to do with exchange, cooperative exchange, but the sixth house has to do with conflicting exchange. So we expect people with Mercury in the sixth house are argumentative, assuming that the way they need to react is defensive. Again, you might think, this is very depressing. I don't want to have Mercury in the sixth house. I don't want to be defensive. And yes, maybe you are being overly defensive and you're ruining your relationships. But being defensive can be a really good thing if it's in the right measure and applied in the right ways, because most people are really out to get us. So bear that in mind, that it's not really negativity or positivity in the planet and the house, but in how it sits with everything else in the chart to show how you would use this trait. These so-called negative traits of certain planets and certain houses can be used in positive or negative ways, depending on how well you, as the native, understand yourself and understand these dynamics within you. The final seed of Mercury in the sixth house is that Mercury has to do with relaxation, but the sixth house has to do with anxiety. And so people with Mercury in the sixth house, they tend to be anxious. And what do we mean about anxious? They don't stop thinking about the problem. They don't stop thinking about the enemy, the danger, the rival, the competitor. They don't relax and let that go. Is that a negative trait? Yeah, it can be really negative and stressful to be like that. But that can also be a positive trait because it can make you very successful, because you will spend the time and energy to figure out how to defeat your opponent and overcome your problems. Sure enough, very important, successful, positive contributors to society have had Mercury in the sixth house. Take a look at some of them. Good examples of Mercury in the sixth house. They all kind of have that tough edge to them, but they all use that to their advantage. Let's take a look at some of their charts and details and see why. Now, of course, it has to do with how they've learned about themselves during their lifetime, but also you can see from the chart how easy or difficult it will be for a native to learn how to use this thing positively or negatively. So in the case of Kamala Harris, sure, she has Mercury in the sixth house, but Mercury is her first lord. She has a Gemini ascendant. The first lord tends to be given positive interpretations wherever it goes. So that's one thing. Also, her sixth house from the ascendant is also the sixth house from the moon. So having Mercury in the sixth house, it's getting the synergy of being in the sixth house twice. It's like a bhavottama situation. And so it's developing a synergy where it becomes like swakshetra or domicile in how it operates. It's used to being in this place. It's deeply in this place, and so it starts to work better in this place. Also, her Jupiter and her ninth lord, Saturn, both strongly aspect this sixth house. And we know that when benefic planets and benefic lords affect a house, the interpretation of that house has to be put in a more positive light. So you would interpret Kamala Harris as a person who doesn't trust people, who assumes that they're out to get her, whom you have to prove yourself to her before she accepts you as a friend, and who always thinks about how to defeat problems and overcomes enemies. And that is not her weakness, but her strength. Let's take a look at Russell Brand. Russell Brand has Mercury in the 6th house, but his 6th house is Gemini. Here you have a planet in its own sign. And that makes the interpretations much more positive, or much more easier to go towards their positive permutation or possibility. He also has Capricorn ascending. And so everything about Mercury, which is oriented towards being critical of others, has some synergy now. Because Capricorn is also really good at being cynical and being critical and being suspicious of others. So just as Kamala Harrison had this synergy in her chart, causing her Mercury to be better, Russell Brand has the same thing, same synergy, a synergy between Mercury in the 6th house and Capricorn ascending. Furthermore, his 8th lord and his 6th lord have joined in the 6th house. So his 8th lord Sun has joined his 6th lord Mercury, and this is a positive, powerful yoga to put 2 Dustan lords in the same place in a Dustan. I think we should also take a look at Lionel Messi's chart, because he's a good example of knowing how to defeat the enemies and not assuming that anybody is going to make a mistake or give him anything. And also, he's interesting because he has an athletic application. So sure enough, his Mercury in the 6th house is with Mars. That explains or points us in the right direction of assuming that the traits of his Mercury in the 6th house would apply themselves to athletics or competition. In addition, it's not just Mars, but Mars is his 3rd lord, so it really makes it clear to us. He again has the 8th lord in the 6th house. His Mercury is the 8th lord. So just like with Russell Brand, he's got this synergy of a Dustan lord going into another Dustan house, which gives things a positive slant. Furthermore, he has the 3rd lord joining the 8th lord in the 6th house, so it's very powerful in defeating opponents. So that aspect of being anxious, which is the potential of Mercury in the 6th house, for him it turns out to be, he's really got his enemies on his mind. He figures them out before they defeat him. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. The newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.